Class, this is Dr. Anderson again, and we are continuing to discuss the endocrine system, and we're going to put some regulation together. How the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary and how the pituitary regulates peripheral glands. And we're going to concentrate on the secretion of growth hormone. So here are our learning objectives. First, I want you to compare and contrast the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, which uses a portal system, versus the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, which uses long axons to project down to the posterior pituitary. When we talk about the negative feedback regulation of the endocrine system, there's a sort of pattern of regulation between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the endocrine glands. So the hypothalamus produces a hormone that goes through the portal system and interacts with the anterior pituitary. The pituitary produces a hormone that goes throughout the general circulation and interacts with a peripheral gland, which makes the hormone that does the function that we associate with that pathway. And I have a critical thinking exercise 8.2 that going through that exercise will help you get at that pattern. And as our major example of endocrine regulation, we're going to use the growth hormone pathway. So growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to go to the pituitary, anterior pituitary, which releases growth hormone. Then growth hormone goes out to the periphery, and we get the release of insulin-like growth factor 1, having effects throughout the system. So this is a diagram that just sort of talks about regulation in general. Dr. Kierstead told you about a pathway where we have a preganglionic neuron from the autonomic nervous system that synapses on the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla produces the hormone epinephrine. We also have situations where you can have a preganglionic neuron that projects to a ganglion, and that ganglion, in that ganglion we release acetylcholine that binds to a nicotinic receptor. Then you have a postganglionic neuron that can synapse on some kind of gland. So for example, the parasympathetic nervous system synapses on the islets in the pancreas, and we get the release of insulin. That's an example of a pathway. We also have, this is the 3 tiers of regulation that we're going to be talking about. The hypothalamus produces a hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary produces a hormone, and then there's another step going out to the periphery. And then here we have a neuron in the hypothalamus, which projects down to the posterior pituitary, and we get a release of hormone. There are 2 hormones that are released in this fashion, ADH and oxytocin. So here's a number of neural mechanisms, or the way the central nervous system interacts with the nervous system. It's a very important interface that occurs here. So the posterior pituitary has an old-fashioned name called the neurohypophysis. We used to call it the neurohypophysis. Now we call it the posterior pituitary. And the posterior pituitary isn't really a gland. It's simply an embryonic extension of the hypothalamus. It doesn't synthesize any hormone. It simply is the release point. So there are neurosecretory axons that start in the hypothalamus, project down through the stalk of the pituitary into the posterior pituitary, and that is where the hormone is released into a vascular system. And as I mentioned previously, there are 2 hormones that are processed in this way. One is ADH, also called vasopressin, that has its effects on the kidney. And the second is oxytocin, which has its effects on the breast and the uterus. And we'll be talking about this hormone when we get to reproduction. So notice that we have neurons that start in the hypothalamus, and they are truly neurons. They have a cell body, they have dendrites, they have leak channels, they have a resting membrane potential, they have voltage-gated channels, they're able to propagate action potentials. So they're neurons that release hormones. So we call them neurosecretory cells. And we have neurons that can release ADH and neurons that can release oxytocin. And they project down through the stalk of the pituitary. They synapse on a capillary bed, and then their hormone is then secreted into the basically into the venous blood. That blood's going to go to the right heart, through the lungs, through the left heart, and then out through the body. Oxytocin has its effects for uterine contractions during labor and on the mammary glands for milk letdown. ADH works on the kidneys. It basically helps the body save water. It also has some effects on arterioles under certain conditions, but the kidney effects are what we'll be talking about in this course. The anterior pituitary receives a hormone from the hypothalamus. So here's a neurosecretory cell. Notice the axon is a lot shorter, but it's an axon. It's got voltage-gated channels. It's having an action potential, opening voltage-gated calcium channels in the axon terminus, causing vesicles to be released. You remember all that from neurons? It's the same thing. However, instead of releasing a neurotransmitter, we're releasing what's called a releasing hormone. Some of them are inhibitory, but a lot of times they're excitatory. They go into this capillary bed, which then goes to another set of blood vessels, and then another capillary bed. So this is referred to as a portal system, the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. A portal system is one that allows two capillary beds to be connected without going through the heart. So we have our first capillary bed, the portal system, then the secondary capillary bed. Notice the capillary bed feeds a bunch of cells in the anterior pituitary, and these all make their own kind of hormone. So some make growth hormone, some make thyroid stimulating hormone, some make adrenocorticotropic hormone, some makes prolactin, some makes FSH and LH. Now, your textbook tells you all the names of these cells. So corticotrophs produce ACTH, and lactotrophs produce prolactin and that sort of thing. I don't really care so much that you know the names of the cells. I am much more interested in that you know there are cells that produce growth hormone, and there are cells that produce thyroid stimulating hormone, and there are cells that produce FSH and LH. So here are three tiers. There are neurons or neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, and different neurons produce growth hormone releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone. Then you have cells in the anterior pituitary, some that produce growth hormone, some that produce TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, some that produce ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then cells that produce LH and FSH. Then there are peripheral target cells that produce IGFs in response to growth hormone, that produce thyroid hormone in response to thyroid stimulating hormone, that produce cortisol in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone, that produce sex hormones in response to LH and FSH. Now, I'll just say, I just threw the names of a lot of hormones at you. Just take a big breath and calm down. We will practice going through these feedback mechanisms. You'll practice going through them. And I want you to appreciate that they all kind of follow the same pattern. So growth hormone releasing hormone. Comes from the hypothalamus, goes through the pituitary, hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, goes to the pituitary, which releases growth hormone. Then growth hormone goes out, and one of the places it goes is the liver, which produces insulin-like growth factors. So that's a pathway. That's those 3 tiers in one pathway. TRH goes through the portal system, causes the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary. TSH goes to the thyroid gland, and we get thyroid hormone. So I want you to start to see the pattern, and that makes it a lot easier to remember. The other thing is, on your exam, I will give you a table, or I will give you some lists of hormones. And so you'll see GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, hypothalamus, that type of thing. I will give you the names that will help you on the test. So it's not, oh my gosh, I have to memorize all these words, but, oh, I know the concepts and I will know how to apply them on the exam. So here's another way to think about those 3 tiers. There's some stimulus that interacts with the brain. And the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain, makes a hypothalamic hormone. It goes into the blood and travels through that portal system. Then it goes to the anterior pituitary. That's the 2nd tier. And the anterior pituitary makes a hormone that goes into the plasma, circulates throughout the whole body, then finds the peripheral gland. The peripheral gland is the 3rd tier. And that makes a peripheral hormone. And that goes in the plasma, and then it acts and carries out the function that we associate with that hormone. And this is the general pattern. Now, there can be little variations. So, for example, FSH and LH come from the anterior pituitary, go into the blood, go through the circulation, and would go to the ovaries. And FSH starts stimulating the follicle, and then the follicle starts producing estrogen. Estrogen then has sort of a ramping up, and estrogen levels get higher and higher. I'll be able to make this clear when we get to the menstrual cycle. But sometimes there are little variations. But if you get all absorbed in the details and the variations and miss the fact that we've got this sort of 3-tier pattern, it'll be a lot harder to get at that, to get at this concept. So I want you to see, we're going to go hypothalamus to anterior pituitary to peripheral gland, and that's the basic pattern of regulation. So we're going to use growth hormone as our specific example. And I may need to change the name of this table now that I'm recording this this presentation. But this is a summary of some of the things that growth hormone does. Growth hormone goes to tissue types. One place is the liver, and another important place is the bones, and causes the synthesis of insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor is what we call a mitogen. In other words, it causes cells to divide. So you have cells growing in number, and then that causes the tissues to grow. Growth hormone is very important for the stimulation of protein synthesis. So tissues grow, cells grow in size because they make more and more proteins. Growth hormone has an interesting relationship with insulin. Insulin is permissive for the action of growth hormone, so you need insulin around in order for a person to grow fully. On the other hand, when you make growth hormone turns around and opposes insulin's actions, and this is particularly centered around blood glucose level. Insulin tends to decrease blood glucose level. Growth hormone tends to increase blood glucose level. So here are a lot of the things that can stimulate growth hormone. All right. So if you have low blood sugar, that's a major stimulus for the growth hormone pathway. If you have fewer fatty acids, if you have increased levels of amino acids, the sympathetics, deep sleep, and some other hormones like testosterone and estrogen, thyroid glands. This is a hormone you produce when you're hungry called ghrelin. All right. So if you're low in nutrition, if you have a acute stress, if you're sleeping deeply, or some other hormones, those will stimulate growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone goes through the portal system, binds to cells that make growth hormone. Growth hormone then goes into the blood and has some metabolic effects. It promotes protein synthesis. It increases your blood glucose level. Growth hormone is also going to go to the liver, the bone, some muscle, your connective tissue, particularly the cartilage, going to produce these substances called insulin-like growth factors, or IGF-1. And IGF-1 causes cells in cartilage to produce factors that promote cell division. That's particularly true in cartilage, or cause cells to grow in size. So muscle cells aren't necessarily going to grow in number, but they're going to grow in size. Now, notice the feedback. As IGFs increase, they're going to feed back and inhibit growth hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary and inhibit GHRH from the hypothalamus. Growth hormone can also feed back and inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone. Now, on the flip side, if you have high glucose and high fat, if you have low levels of amino acids, as we get older, if you have high levels of growth hormone and IGFs, those will stimulate growth hormone inhibiting hormone, will turn off growth hormone release, and will decrease the metabolic effects and decrease levels of IGF. So if IGF and growth hormone are low, then we remove the negative feedback, and GHRH can increase and growth hormone can increase. So the thing we're regulating by negative feedback is basically the level of IGF and the level of growth. If we don't have enough nutrients around, we are going to increase GRH, or increase GHRH and increase growth hormone, so we can increase the release of those nutrients. We're going to break down fat and increase fatty acid level. We're going to increase blood glucose level. And we're going to use our amino acids to make for protein synthesis and for growth. If we have plenty of glucose around, if we have low levels of amino acids, if we have low levels of our growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone, then we're going to lower our IGF and we're going to have less growth. So we have a very complicated, here's our first tier, here's our second tier, here's our third tier. And the thing that's really being regulated by negative feedback is the third tier. What's the level of growth? What's the level of IGF? You don't want too much and you don't want too little. Here's another diagram that sort of gets at that. So if you're exercising, if you're stressed, again, that's your sympathetic stimulus. If you're fasting, if you have low plasma glucose, so you have low glucose around, or if you're sleeping, that causes the production of insulin-like growth factor, or growth hormone releasing hormone. That goes into the portal system. We get growth hormone, and then we get IGF, and here we're talking from the liver. We increase plasma IGF. If plasma IGF is high, it feeds back and inhibits growth hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone. It feeds back and stimulates SS. Now, what the heck is SS? SS is the same thing as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So whoops, let me get my pen. So SS equals growth, whoops, I didn't want that, hormone inhibiting hormone. And let me get my G back. So SS, somatostatin, is the very same thing as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. The term growth hormone inhibiting hormone is what our author Derrickson uses. And this diagram I got from a different textbook. All right. So how does this all work in the bones? I want you to notice that there's this area here called the epiphyseal plate. Some people call it the growth plate. What the heck's going on in the growth plate? In the growth plate, we have cartilage cells. Cartilage cells. And under the influence of IGF, these cartilage cells will grow in number, and then they will mature, and they'll push out, and they'll start to get turned into bone. The area around them will calcify, and they'll turn into bone. So this growth plate growing out in this direction, and particularly in that direction, is what allows a bone to get longer. We call that linear growth. So before puberty, you have a cartilaginous epiphyseal plate. And as you're going through your growth spurt, it means your growth hormone, along with your sex hormones and some other hormones, are stimulating this growth plate so you get taller. So somewhere in puberty, you had a growth spurt and you got really, really tall because you're, or maybe not so much. I didn't get really, really tall. But that's the growing of the growth plate. At some point at the end of puberty, the growth plate becomes completely calcified. And when that happens, you've reached your adult height. Now you might say, oh, but Dr. A, I was 22 years old and I grew a ½ an inch. Well, I don't have anything to say about whether you've completed puberty or not at age 22. All I'm saying is you had a little bit of cartilage left if you were able to grow a ½ an inch. So when you're at your fully adult height, all of that cartilage has been turned into bone, and you no longer have cartilage at the growth plate. And then at that point, growth hormone and IGF participate in the maintenance function. So we have cells that lay down bones, we have cells that destroy bones, and they need to be in balance. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail on that, but I want you to understand why bones grow longer during puberty, and then they stop getting longer after puberty because of the fusion of that epiphyseal growth plate. So before puberty, growth hormone and IGF cause your bones to grow longer. So if you're in puberty and you have an excess of growth hormone and you're going to be really, really, really tall, and you're going to have a condition called giantism, or some people call it gigantism. Giantism and gigantism are the same thing. After puberty, the epiphyseal plate is sealed. Now what the hormones do is control the turnover of bone and the maintenance of bone. So if you have excess growth hormone after puberty, then you have a condition called acromegaly. Now we're not using the textbook Vander, but here we go. Here's the picture from Vander that I'm referring to. That's a different textbook. These men are identical twins. Identical twins. And this fella right here has a pituitary tumor that produces excess growth hormone. So what do you notice? He's much taller. Look how big his hands are. Look how big his feet are. So he has a lot of growth in the joints, a lot of soft tissue growth. Also notice that his forehead is more prominent, his jaw is more prominent. because a lot more bone, a lot has been laid down along the jawline. Now, you may think it's a really cool thing to be extra tall, and it's actually not. He probably also has blood glucose levels that are too high. He probably has type 2 diabetes, and people with gigantism tend to die of heart failure. So it's actually not fun being tall. And it's an awful lot of weight on your knees and your hips and your feet because you're going to have all this soft tissue growth. So you have a lot of weight and a lot of growth in your joints, and there's a lot of pain that comes from that. So it ends up being a tough thing to deal with. All right. Now, I'm not so interested in the function of thyroid hormone, but let's think about how thyroid hormone is regulated. Remember, we have a first tier. That first tier is the hypothalamus, and it produces thyroid-releasing hormone, or TRH. That goes through the portal system, and we go to the anterior pituitary, which produces a second hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone goes through the whole body, finds the thyroid gland, and the thyroid produces two types of thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. These are derivatives of tyrosine that have been iodinated, and iodide, when it forms a side chain, it actually makes the molecule quite lipid soluble. So thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, and even though it's an amino acid derivative, it works like the steroids. It diffuses into the cell, promotes gene transcription and the formation of new proteins. And the major thing it does is increase metabolism. And of course, we use that example with permissiveness, where thyroid hormone increases beta receptors and makes tissue more sensitive to epinephrine. So here's the picture from your textbook. If you have low levels of T3 or T4, or your metabolism is low, then you produce TRH from the hypothalamus. It goes through the portal system. You produce TSH from the anterior pituitary. It goes to the thyroid gland, which produces T3 and T4. When T3 and T4 are too high, they feed back and inhibit TSH, and they inhibit TRH, so that our levels of thyroid hormone don't get too high. If thyroid hormone is too low, then we stimulate the pathway again. So metabolism and the levels of T3 and T4 are the things that are being regulated by negative feedback. So of the hormones in the thyroid axis, which must go through the heart before they reach their target? Well, TRH how does it reach its target? It goes through the portal. And then we get TSH. Whoops. TSH. TSH goes into the circulation, and, oh, I need a T, goes through the heart. Then goes to the thyroid gland, and we get thyroid hormone, which of course is T3 and T4. That goes into the venous blood, has to go to its heart, and then there are receptors for thyroid hormone all over the body. So TSH and thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, need to go through the heart to get to their targets. But TRH goes straight to its target without going through the heart. That's because it has a portal system. Okay, let's look at the regulation of cortisol. We have CRH from the hypothalamus, which leads to ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and cortisol from the adrenal gland. So cortisol is a steroid, and it works through gene transcription, and it's mainly a stress hormone. So when we get stressed out, we produce cortisol, and that makes sure that our blood vessels maintain our pressure, and it makes sure we have enough nutrients to withstand the stress. So it helps us deal with stress. The problem is if we are chronically stressed and we're stressed and stressed and stressed and stressed, chronic cortisol secretion can actually cause health consequences. So there's a lot that you probably read in the news and in journal articles and in maybe some of your other classes about how we need to manage our stress so that we're not falling prey to health disorders like heart disease and stroke and that kind of thing. So again, here's your hypothalamus. We release cortisol, corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, that's going to go through the portal, and then we get ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which then goes to the adrenal cortex, and we get cortisol. Cortisol helps us manage the stress, but then we have a way to turn this system off when the stress is over, because cortisol inhibits the anterior pituitary and inhibits the hypothalamus through high levels of cortisol. And then that gives us a negative feedback mechanism. And remember, what does it mean to have negative feedback? It means that if you have some stimulus, then you have a response that counteracts the stimulus. So if your stimulus is stress, you raise cortisol, and when the stress is over, you inhibit, you bring cortisol back down. If your stimulus is a high level of thyroid hormone, then you inhibit the system to bring thyroid hormone level back to where it should be. If your thyroid hormone is too low, then you stimulate the pathway, bring up thyroid hormone to where it should be. So that's how this negative feedback mechanism works. So, what hormonal changes would be expected if a patient developed a left adrenal tumor hypersecreting cortisol? What would happen to the right adrenal cortex? Well, you have your hypothalamus that's going to produce CRH. That goes down to your adrenal anterior pituitary, which produces ACTH. And we have a right and a left. So I'm going to say this is the right, and it's from the patient's perspective. So we get a tumor, and it produces a lot of cortisol. That cortisol is going to do what to the hypothalamus? It's going to inhibit. It's going to do what to the anterior pituitary? It's going to inhibit. So if we have low levels of ACTH, we're going to have low levels of cortisol from the right side. So the right side will be inhibited. Now, why don't we inhibit the left side? Because the left side has a tumor, and tumors do not respond to negative feedback. All righty, we are at the end of another presentation. So think about what your questions are. Write them down. Bring them to class. Write them on the forum. Go through 8.2, cells to systems. I'll also mention there's an 8.4. 8.4 is not required for this class. Another thing you could do, take a blank piece of paper. Look at your learning objectives. Can you write down a paragraph about your learning objectives from listening to this presentation or reading your book? If you can't do it, then you don't know the concepts well enough. Go through the PowerPoint again, read your textbook again, review some of the concepts, then try it again. Then maybe a few days later, over the weekend, try it again. See how much you remember. See how much you're able to write down without looking at your book and without looking at your notes. Try explaining it to one of your friends in lab. If you can explain it to someone else, then you're going to know that you know it. And you know you're going to know it into the marrow of your bones, not just have a familiarity with the material. All righty. Well, thank you for working hard. Thank you for listening to this presentation. And I look forward to seeing you in class. So bye for now.